So in this chapter, we are going to examine the blood and look at all the individual components of that, the functions of that, and then end up looking at this idea of sharing this tissue, since it is one of the most commonly shared tissues, as well as some of the mechanisms that help us or assist us when we damage a blood vessel and are at risk of losing blood. All right? So again, this just reminds you that, look, the cells in your body, numbering the order of about 75 trillion, most of them are not mobile, right? They're not getting up and going to get the nutrients. They're not getting up and going to get your gases like oxygen. They're not getting up and moving out to get rid of their waste. So we're going to use this tissue, blood, to help us manage cell homeostasis. And I do have to remind students that, look, the cardiovascular system in which blood is being moved is really just a series of connected tubes, right? So again, blood never leaks out of the tubes, and a pump that is going to help keep this fluid going and delivering and removing waste, delivering nutrients, removing waste from the cells, right? So the functions of the blood, there are three basic functions we talk about. First of all, blood transports, right? It's a river, so it moves a number of things, as we just talked about, to the cells for delivery, right? And this includes your nutrients like amino acids and glucose and fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, water in general, because the plasma is like 92% water, so water is very important here. Ions, these we even balanced, right? They were so important. We balanced the glucose levels with hormones. We balanced sodium, potassium, and calcium with hormones. Gases, we had a hormone devoted to that as well. And then, of course, we have to remove waste to meet that function. Defense is done by the blood, and this is predominantly the leukocytes. They're also known as white blood cells. And then platelets help us when we cut ourselves. So it's really a response to injury, whereas the leukocytes are responding to infection or contamination. All right. And then lastly, we would say that the blood regulates or maintains homeostasis of a number of different things. Here we have, again, temperature of your body stays constant because blood moves heat. pH stays constant because blood has buffers, and when that waste gets dumped into it from the cells, the buffers that are already present in the blood can help keep pH constant. All right. This is looking at three different blood samples. We did a hematocrit, and again, that's the name for the test for this. This is actually looking at a tube as opposed to a capillary tube, but an actual tube that you might do a blood collection in. But the idea is the same. You separate out this homogeneous connective tissue, and you get two major components. You get a very liquid matrix called the plasma, and then you get the cells, which are also called the formed elements. And so in this cartoon, again, plasma, the matrix, is the majority, normally, of the blood tissue. And then it's followed closely by the red blood cells. And then there's a little bit of white blood cell platelet volume. So here again, they give you the normal, and I said I'm not going to ask you to know the actual numbers, but here's the normal range for how much blood, how many red blood cells or erythrocytes you should have compared to plasma. This shows an anemic person in which the red blood cell ratio, there's quite a bit less, and this is polycythemia where there's quite a bit more. All right. Characteristically, blood is easy to tell, and this also tells us something about it, right? Its color, and in fact it lends the only color in the body, is due to hemoglobin and the amount of oxygen bound to it, the amount of carbon monoxide bound to it, the amount of carbon dioxide bound to it, changes its shape and therefore its color, its density. It's very close. It's a liquid, right? And therefore it is also very close to water, which is again the majority of plasma. Temperature is most people know. You've got 98.6 on average, which is about 38 degrees Celsius. The pH is between 7.35 and 7.45. And the volume, it's actually not the majority of the fluids in the body, okay, because you have about 42 liters of fluid in the body, and blood is somewhere in the order of 5 to 6 liters. All right. So this table just kind of shows this idea of the overall cellular stuff that we call the formed elements, because the red blood cells or erythrocytes and the platelets are no longer intact cells. They've lost some of their organelles, or all of their organelles, really. And so they can't go on to reproduce themselves or repair themselves. So they're no longer what we call really true cells, even though, again, that suffix "cyte" means cell. So this just shows you, hey, where are they made and what is their function. So it's a nice, very straightforward table on those formed elements. So we will look at each of these things separately and throughout this chapter. You'll notice here again that the majority of them are made in red bone marrow. The lymphocytes can be made in lymphatic tissue, like tonsils and lymph nodes and spleen as well. Right? And then again, here's your basic function for each of these. All right, so lots and lots of things are found in plasma. Okay, so the cells we'll look through separately, but first we're going to say, here's what you see in plasma. And note that this does most of the transportation and regulation that we talked about for functions. Though, about like 92% of this is water, and then the rest of it is mostly proteins, but then we have ions, again, like you learned about in chapter on endocrine, like sodium and potassium and calcium, but there's also bicarbonates, and there's small amounts of other ions, gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Some of them are dissolved, not a lot, but some of them are dissolved in plasma. Hormones, like anything we talked about, again, in the previous chapter. Enzymes get moved through the body, and some of the enzymes have a function in the blood. Waste, like, again, carbon dioxide, urea, uric acid, creatinine. And then nutrients, all your nutrients that come in through the small intestine would be found in the plasma. Amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, and carbohydrates, the glucose specifically. All right. This chart looks at the idea of the plasma proteins specifically, which are the majority of the non-water stuff in plasma. And as I say here, most of these are actually made by the liver and stay in the blood. They're not meant for anything else. They wouldn't be taken into the cell. They wouldn't be rearranged and made into something else. So here again is where we're focusing. And then this is on the previous slide I mentioned. Here's the other things you'd find in plasma. So the three we're interested in, the three groups, albumin, globulins, and fibrinogen, right? Most of this is albumin. And then, as you see here again, liver. This is the only one not predominantly made by the liver. And that's because the gamma globulin, which is also the Ig, or immunoglobulins, all right? The gamma globulins are they're your antibodies, and they are made by the lymph tissues and secreted into the plasma. Okay, so functions of these, well, albumin is very important for maintaining our osmotic concentration. So again, what this implies is that because albumin, as we said, stays in the blood, there's a certain amount of water, there's the osmotic, that remains in the blood associated with the albumin. And then albumin itself would be able to help transport lipid molecules, because lipids, being nonpolar, are not going to interact readily with the plasma. So we're going to look at ways that we move lipids, but here in a later chapter on nutrients, but here we also mentioned that some of the lipids that are moved from one place to another in the body would be bound to albumin. And then we see for the alpha and beta globulins that they are also important for osmotic concentration. So again, they remain in the blood, and with them remains water. So blood stays a liquid because of these proteins. And then the gamma globulins are there for your immune response, the antibodies. Right? Fibrinogen, we're going to learn later on in this chapter, is really for the process of hemostasis, and it's going to be the last. It's going to be converted during coagulation into fibrin, which will then stop the loss of blood. All right. So this is the kind of family tree for our blood cells, and you'll note that everybody we're going to talk about as far as the cellular components comes from this one cell here that's called the hematocytoblast. Okay, so, and this lives in the red bone marrow, and this lives your entire life in the red bone marrow, but it replaces itself on a regular basis, and as it goes through mitosis, some of the cells produced by it will then go on to become differentiated. And when they differentiate, it means they become different things. And here's the things they can become. Okay? And I say here too that the cellular aspects of your blood all have a fairly limited lifespan. And so you have to have a constant production to match that destruction. But we do always want to caveat that that rate of production just depends on what's going on in you. All right? So again, the whole process is called hemato or hemopoiesis. Right? It is started by this hemocytoblast, and this occurs in red bone marrow throughout your life. All right? So in this family tree, again, shown here, we say, again, the stem cell is exposed to chemical stimuli. So that is what is going to control the rate of production. Right? And there are two basic family lines as seen here, a myeloid and a lymphoid. But I won't ask you this on a test. I'm just repeating and enlightening you as you read about this in the book. So certain cells come from the lymphoid line and certain come from the myeloid line. All right? Here are the chemicals that stimulate the production. So there are three basic groups of cells made by the red bone marrow. So three different groups of compounds. So erythropoietin, and erythro is red, poietin is production of. So this was actually made in the kidney, we learned about in the chapter on endocrine, and it was stimulated by low oxygen levels. Okay? And then this, right, this would tell the red bone marrow, so the target would be the red bone marrow, to make more red blood cells. Okay? So you need erythropoietin to help manage the number of red blood cells. Okay? If you had excess amount of erythropoietin, which can happen, it can be abused, or it could be produced when you exercise, and also if you moved to a higher altitude or went to visit a higher altitude, this could be produced. And in this circumstance, you would make more red blood cells so that you could carry oxygen, and it would also make the blood viscous. It would make it thicker. So this would increase resistance, that we're going to learn about when we talk about the heart and blood vessels, and this would make the heart work harder. So we have to balance that. We don't want too many red blood cells, as attractive as that sounds, right? Thrombopoietin, so thrombocytes, platelets. The liver makes that. Liver and kidneys produce this compound, and it's going to, again, target the red bone marrow. And this would help manage the number of platelets or thrombocytes. Cytokines are made by a lot of cells. The two that we want to just remark on are colony-stimulating factors and interleukins. These are groups of chemicals again. And these would then, of course, stimulate red bone marrow as well as lymphoid tissues. All right, so the erythrocyte is what we're going to cover in the next, because I think we should stop the recording here, and we'll pick up on the next one talking about the red blood cells and how they manage to transport all this oxygen and what happens when they don't.